On a blistering morning in September 1942, somewhere in the Egyptian desert behind General Montgomery's lines, Commander Richard Daniel crouched beside a fuel supply depot and watched American gasoline seep into the sand. The temperature had already risen beyond 100 degrees Fahrenheit, heat waves shimmering off the rocky ground. The air reeked of petroleum and scorched metal. Daniel was a quality control officer for the United States Navy, a chemical engineer by training assigned to American refineries in the Middle East. His responsibility was to ensure that fuel shipped from the United States actually reached the combat vehicles that depended on it. That morning, however, he witnessed something that would trouble him for the remainder of the war. Before him were hundreds of American fuel cans, 5-gallon containers manufactured in the United States, shipped across the Atlantic through submarine-infested waters, unloaded at Egyptian ports, and hauled by rail to this depot. They were meant to supply Montgomery's tanks for the coming offensive against Rommel. Instead, they were hemorrhaging gasoline through split seams and corroded joints. The desert sun had transformed each can into a swollen, leaking liability. Thin metal expanded under the heat, and seams that had been tight in a Pennsylvania factory were now pulling apart beneath the relentless Egyptian sun. Dark stains spread beneath the stacked containers, and the smell of evaporating fuel lingered in the air like an accusation. Daniel picked one up. The rolled seams along the bottom were already beginning to fail. Fuel trickled down his hand, soaking the sleeve of his uniform. The screw cap was corroded, its threads stripped from rough handling during transport. He needed a wrench just to open it. He hurled it back onto the pile in disgust. 40%. That was his estimate after 3 days of inspection, a figure he later admitted was deliberately exaggerated to provoke alarm in Washington. Yet even if the true losses were lower, the scale of waste was shocking. Fuel refined in America, transported by American sailors through submarine-infested seas, paid for by American taxpayers, was soaking uselessly into desert sand. What made Daniel's stomach churn was what sat just 20 feet away, neatly stacked, flawless captured German fuel cans, the enemy's containers. Not a single leak, not a single bulging side, not a single corroded cap. American and British soldiers fought over them like prized possessions, hoarding them, trading cigarettes for them, refusing to let them out of their sight. Daniel walked over and lifted one of the German cans. It felt heavier, sturdier. He flipped a lever on top and the spout opened instantly, no wrench required. He tilted the can and fuel flowed out in a smooth, rapid stream without splashing or gurgling. He flipped the lever back and it sealed tight. The entire process took 3 seconds. Daniel stood holding a German can in one hand and an American can in the other. One functioned perfectly, the other was a disaster, and Americans had been relying on the disaster for nearly 3 years of war. He set them down and stood beneath the Egyptian sun trying to understand how this had happened. How had America, the most industrially advanced nation on earth, failed to produce a simple fuel container that worked? He did not yet realize that he had stumbled upon one of the greatest unforced errors of the Second World War, or that the United States had already seen the solution, studied it in detail, and deliberately discarded it. The German fuel can that would alter history was conceived between 1935 and 1937, developed through a systematic military procurement process in the industrial town of Schwelm, Germany, nestled in the hills of North Rhine-Westphalia. Adolf Hitler understood something many military planners overlooked: the weakest link in plans for lightning warfare was not tanks, aircraft, or trained soldiers, but fuel supply. His panzer divisions could only advance as fast as their gasoline followed. Every armored thrust depended on a supply chain stretching back to refineries and depots. If that chain failed, if fuel containers broke down in the field, the entire blitzkrieg concept would collapse. Hitler had studied the First World War and knew that major offensives had stalled not only because of enemy resistance, but because of logistical exhaustion. Armies outran their supplies. Fuel shortages killed momentum. He was determined that German mechanized forces would never face that fate. In late 1935, the German army issued a tender for a new fuel container with demanding specifications. It had to hold 20 liters, roughly 5 gallons. It needed to survive rough handling, falls from trucks, stacking in depots, and transport over terrible roads. It had to function in extreme temperatures, from the scorching deserts of North Africa to the frozen steppes of Russia. It needed to be easy to carry, quick to open, and fast to pour, and it had to be manufacturable in enormous quantities using existing German industrial capacity. The task landed at Schwelmer Eisenwerk Müller & Company, where Chief Engineer Vinzenz Grunvogel accepted the challenge. Grunvogel was a meticulous engineer with an instinctive understanding of how equipment was actually used. He did not design from behind a desk. He spoke with soldiers, watched them handle gear, and studied the conditions they endured. Grunvogel quickly realized he was not designing a simple container, he was designing a weapon. Every feature had to serve the realities of mechanized warfare. Soldiers needed to haul fuel across brutal terrain, pour it quickly under fire, and store it without losing a single drop. The container had to survive being tossed from moving trucks, baked in 100-degree heat, frozen solid in Russian winters, and stacked by the thousands in depots. It had to function when soldiers were exhausted, frightened, operating in darkness, and under enemy fire. Existing designs were inadequate. Like industry everywhere, German manufacturers had relied on simple rectangular cans with screw caps. They leaked, required tools, were slow to fill and empty, and could not withstand military abuse. Grunvogel started from first principles. How much weight could a soldier realistically carry? How would they grip the can? How would thousands be stacked? How could it be opened instantly in combat? How would metal behave under extreme temperature changes? He built prototypes, tested them, refined them, and tested again. By 1936, 5,000 prototype cans were produced for troop trials. Soldiers used them in realistic field conditions and reported what worked and what failed. Grunvogel listened and adjusted the design accordingly. Handles were modified, closures improved, indentation patterns optimized. After refinement through field testing, the final design was officially adopted by the Wehrmacht on July 8, 1937, designated in General Army Bulletin No. 324 as the Wehrmacht-Einheitskanister, the Armed Forces Standard Fuel Container. It would become known to the Allies simply as the jerry can and would prove to be one of the most important pieces of military equipment of the entire war. The German can held 20 liters, about 5 gallons. It was rectangular, stackable, and constructed from two pressed steel halves welded together along a recessed seam around the middle. That recessed seam was the first stroke of genius. By protecting the weld inside a channel, Grunvogel ensured that impacts and rough handling would not damage the joint that held the can together. When dropped or struck, blows hit the flat sides rather than the vulnerable seam. It was a small detail that made an enormous difference. The sides bore distinctive cross-shaped indentations, not decorative but structural, strengthening the can while allowing the metal to flex as fuel expanded or contracted with temperature changes. In the North African heat or the frozen Russian steppes, the can would not burst at the seams. The indentations absorbed the stress. 3 handles ran across the top, solving multiple problems at once. A single soldier could carry 1 full can using the center handle, or 2 empty cans by gripping the outer handles of adjacent cans with 1 hand. In bucket brigade fashion, soldiers could pass cans rapidly down a line, each man grabbing a free handle before handing it along, but the true brilliance lay in the opening mechanism. Instead of a screw cap that required a wrench and inevitably leaked, Grunvogel designed a cam lever closure. A simple flip of the lever opened the spout instantly. Another flip sealed it tight with a rubber gasket. No tools required, no fumbling in combat. No stripped threads or lost caps. Inside the spout, Grunvogel added a small breather tube that connected to an air pocket beneath the handles. When fuel poured out, air flowed in through this tube, creating a smooth, fast stream without the gurgling and splashing that wasted fuel and time. A soldier could empty a full can in seconds. That same air pocket served another purpose. If a full can was dropped into water during an amphibious landing or a river crossing, it would float. The trapped air kept the 45-pound container bobbing on the surface. Finally, the interior was lined with a synthetic resin coating similar to technology originally developed for steel beer barrels. This lining meant the same can could carry gasoline, diesel, or drinking water without contamination. 8 genius details. 8 solutions to problems that would Allied logistics for years. By 1939, the German military had stockpiled thousands of these cans ready for war. The Allies had nothing like it. In the summer of 1939, with war clouds gathering over Europe, an American engineer named Paul Pies was working in Berlin. He was a senior executive at
Ambi Bud Presswork, a German subsidiary of the Philadelphia-based Bud Company.
The firm specialized in pressed steel technologies, producing car bodies for BMW and Ford at a factory that had once
belonged to the aviation pioneer Edmund Rumpler. Crucially, Ambi Bud was one of the manufacturers producing jerry cans for the Vermacar. Pleiss had watched Germany transform over the years he'd worked there. The Nazi regime was openly preparing for war. Military contracts had replaced civilian production. The factory that once made automobile bodies was now building military vehicles. At
some point before the outbreak of war, Pleiss acquired detailed knowledge of the jerry can design.
As a senior executive
at one of the manufacturers, he had direct access to specifications and manufacturing processes.
According to
widely circulated accounts, he obtained physical samples and complete technical specifications, though the exact
circumstances remain unclear from surviving records. What is documented is that Pleiss departed Europe on the SS Washington, leaving Le Havre on September 11, 1939. Just days after Germany invaded Poland, he arrived in New York on September 18.
Carrying knowledge that could have transformed Allied logistics if anyone had been willing to listen.
Back in
America, Pleiss told military officials about the German container.
He explained its features, its superiority, its
potential to transform fuel logistics.
The War Department listened politely and showed little urgency. By the summer of
1940, Pleiss had arranged for a complete jerry can to reach American officials.
He sent one to Washington.
The War Department examined it, acknowledged its clever design, and made a decision that
would cost thousands of lives.
They decided their existing containers were good enough. The American military was still using a cylindrical 10-gallon can with 2 screw closures, a design from the First World War.
It required a wrench to open and a funnel to pour. It was heavy, awkward, and prone to leaking, but it was familiar, and the tooling already existed. The lone German Jerrian was sent to Camp Holler in Maryland, home of the Army's Vehicle Research and Development Center.
There, American engineers were tasked with creating an American version.
What
happened next was a case study in missing the point entirely, a masterclass in how to take a perfect
design and make it worthless. The engineers at Camp Holler looked at the German can and saw a shape. They copied the rectangular form, the 3 handles, the 20L capacity. But they didn't understand why the German design worked.
They saw features without grasping function. They saw a container without seeing the system of interlocking
solutions that made it effective. In a report dated September 18, 1940, delivered to the Armored Force Board entitled Advantages of the German Can, the Camp Holler team had documented exactly why the German design was superior. The German can would stack without shifting or rolling. It was light enough to carry, yet strong enough for field use. A full can would float. The handles were ideal
for bucket brigade operations.
The closure required no tools for opening and no accessories for operation. It would not open without intent and would stay open while pouring. A vent pipe enabled smooth fuel flow. Dirt, sand, and water would not collect around the opening. They understood everything that made the German con brilliant, and then they ignored it all. The American redesign eliminated the cam lever closure.
Instead, they installed a screw cap, the same type that had caused problems for decades.
The official reason was economy.
The Army had stockpiles of screw fittings left over from previous contracts.
Using them would save money. The unofficial reason was institutional inertia. American industry knew how to make screw caps. The tooling existed.
Changing to cam levers would require new equipment, new training, new suppliers.
It was easier to use what they had. The result was that every American soldier would now need a wrench to open his fuel can.
In the chaos of combat, wrenches
got lost. They fell into mud. They disappeared into supply dumps. Soldiers without wrenches couldn't refuel their vehicles.
Soldiers with wrenches fumbled in darkness under fire with cold hands,
trying to turn threads that corroded and stripped after a few uses. The German soldiers flipped a lever in 3 seconds. American soldiers needed a tool in 30 seconds of fumbling. The redesign also eliminated the spout design that allowed easy pouring. A funnel was now required to transfer fuel without spilling. Another tool to carry, to lose, to fumble with. German soldiers tilted and poured.
American soldiers hunted for funnels while gasoline splashed on their boots. The recessed welded seam was replaced with rolled seams around the bottom and one side. Rolled seams were cheaper and faster to produce. They required less skilled labor and simpler equipment.
In a factory, rolled seams made perfect sense. In a war zone, they were a disaster. Rolled seams failed
when cans were dropped. They split when cans expanded in heat. They leaked when cans were stacked, and the weight compressed the bottom layers.
Any petroleum engineer could have explained that storing gasoline in a container with rolled seams was inherently unsafe.
The Germans had known this.
That was why
Grunvogel used a single welded seam placed in a protected recess.
The engineers at Camp Holler either didn't ask the right questions or didn't listen to the answers.
The interior synthetic resin lining was eliminated entirely.
The official reasoning was that the lining added cost and manufacturing complexity.
What the accountants didn't understand was that the lining served multiple purposes. It protected the metal from corrosion, which extended the
can's service life. It prevented fuel from picking up metallic taste, which could indicate contamination. Most importantly, it meant the same can could carry gasoline, diesel, or drinking water without cross-contamination. Without the lining, American cans couldn't safely be used for water.
Soldiers in desert environments where water was as critical as fuel couldn't use their fuel cans to carry water when
needed. They needed separate containers, separate logistics, separate problems. The air pocket and breather tube disappeared from the American design.
These features had enabled German cans to pour quickly and smoothly, to float when dropped in water, and to accommodate temperature expansion without bursting. Without them, American cans poured slowly and splashed fuel
everywhere. They sank when dropped during amphibious operations.
They burst at the seams when the desert sun heated their contents.
The cross-shaped indentations that strengthened German cans while allowing flex were replaced with a simplified X pattern that provided less structural flexibility.
The American cans would be more likely to burst in extreme temperatures, less able to survive impacts, weaker overall.
8 genius details. The Americans missed every single one. They kept the shape and threw away the function. The redesigned American jerry can entered production. First contracts were let in September 1940, and the first American-made jerry cans were delivered in March 1941.
The cans were lighter than the German original. 10 pounds versus 11-12 pounds empty.
That was the only improvement. In every other way, it was a step backward. A monument to the arrogance that assumed American engineers could improve on a design they didn't understand.
Meanwhile, crates of obsolete screw cap fittings sat in army warehouses, finally finding a use.
The money saved on those fittings would be repaid many times over in fuel lost to leaking containers, vehicles stranded
without fuel, and soldiers who died because their tanks ran dry at the wrong moment. The British took a different approach. When British forces first encountered German jerry cans during the invasion of Norway in 1940, they immediately recognized the superior design. These were the Jerry's cans, they said, using slang for Germans.
The name stuck. Later that year, P.S. was in London. British officers asked him about the cans design and manufacture. P.S. provided technical knowledge from his experience at Ambibud.
The British examined the design carefully, documented every feature, and made a decision that would help win the war. They copied it exactly.
British companies including Briggs Motor Bodies, Vauxhall Motors, and the Prest Steel Company began manufacturing faithful reproductions of the German design. Same cam lever closure, same
recessed weld, same breather tube, same synthetic resin lining.
The British understood that the German engineers had already solved every problem.
There was nothing to improve. By early 1943, 2 million British-made jerry cans had been shipped to North Africa, but America remained oblivious.
For 2 more years, American soldiers would suffer with inferior containers while their allies used captured German cans and British copies. The cost of America's mistake became horrifyingly clear in the North African desert.
But before we return to that desert, we need
to understand what the Allies were fighting with before the jerry can arrived.
At the start of the Second World War, the British Army relied on a container officially known as the petrol, oil, and water can. Soldiers called them flimsies.
The name was bitterly accurate.
These 4-gallon cans were made from thin tin plate, typically manufactured where labor was cheap. 5 pieces of flat metal were welded together with crimped or soldered
seams.
The can had a single handle on top, a bent piece of metal that cut into hands and made carrying awkward.
It
required a wrench to remove the screw cap and a funnel to pour without spillage.
The flimsy had been designed for peacetime transport of lamp kerosene along paved European roads. It was adequate for that purpose. It was
utterly inadequate for mechanized warfare in harsh conditions. But when war came, the British Army had nothing else.
Millions of flimsies were in inventory. Changing designs would take time.
Time was something the British
didn't have. In the North African campaign, flimsies proved catastrophic. The consequences would shape the entire war in that theater.
The desert was unforgiving to poorly designed
equipment. Temperatures soared past 120 degrees Fahrenheit in summer. Sand worked its way into every seam and joint. The terrain was rock-strewn and brutal, shaking vehicles and cargo until weaker components failed.
The flimsies were never designed for this. They had been made for gentle transport along European
roads, not the punishment of mechanized desert warfare. The crimped seams split during transport over rough terrain. Every journey across the rock-strewn desert was a gauntlet that the flimsy containers rarely survived intact. Trucks bounced over wadis and through shell craters. Cans slammed against each other, against the truck bed, against anything hard.
Each impact stressed the seams. Each stress brought them closer to failure. A single journey across the desert could transform a shipment of sealed cans into a pile of leaking
wrecks. Some flimsies lost 20% of their contents before reaching their destination. Others lost 50% or more. The loss rate depended on distance, terrain, temperature, and luck. None of these factors were controllable. One quartermaster Astor reported that
his 70,000 gall of fuel had been reduced to just 30,000 gallons during transport. When he complained, he was told that even this was considered a good effort. 30,000 gallons out of 70,000, a loss
rate of 57%. More than half the fuel gone before it reached any vehicle.
When flimsies were
stacked for shipping, the upper layers crushed those below. The thin metal couldn't support the weight. Seams popped.
Fuel leaked in the holds of cargo ships.
This meant gasoline accumulating in the BGES. The vapors built up. Sailors worked in an atmosphere that could explode at any spark.
At least one ship was lost when
the accumulated fuel ignited. The crew never had a chance. In the hot desert sun, the problems multiplied. The thin metal expanded faster than the seams could accommodate. Cans swelled grotesquely. Seams burst. Fuel sprayed across supply dumps.
The smell of evaporating gasoline became the signature scent of Allied logistics in
North Africa.
Every transfer from one container to another required a funnel, and funnels meant spillage. Soldiers watched precious fuel splash on the ground, on their uniforms, on vehicles that were waiting to be refueled.
Each drop lost was a drop that wouldn't power a tank or an aircraft. Each drop lost
was a German advantage. British historian Desmond Young, who served in North Africa and later wrote a biography of Field Marshal Rommel, captured the frustration perfectly.
No one who did
not serve in the desert, he wrote, could realize to what extent the difference between complete and partial success
rested on the simplest item of equipment and the worst. Whoever sent our troops into desert warfare with the petrol tin has much to answer for. General Claude
Aurelec, who commanded British forces in North Africa, estimated that the flimsy containers led to the loss of 30%
of all fuel sent to the theater, 30% as a baseline, higher under adverse conditions, an appalling tax paid to bad engineering. Because of this, General
Arc Harold Wavell's defeat of the Italians in 1940 came to nothing.
His planes sat on desert airfields grounded for lack of fuel.
His tanks halted in the sand, empty.
His trucks couldn't deliver supplies because they had no
fuel to make the trips. The Italians should have been finished.
Instead, they held on because the British couldn't maintain the pressure.
By the time fuel supplies were restored, the moment had passed. General Orange's victory over Ramlin in 1941 withered away for the same
reason. The Desert Fox was in retreat.
The British had him on the ropes, but tanks need fuel to pursue a beaten enemy, and the fuel was bleeding away through split seams and burst cans.
Rommel escaped. He would return stronger than ever. In 1942, General Bernard Montgomery approached El Alamein differently. He refused to attack until he had accumulated overwhelming
supplies. Among those supplies were thousands of captured German jerry cans and newly manufactured British copies. For the first time, British fuel would arrive at the front intact.
Montgomery wanted El Alamein for many reasons, but
reliable fuel containers were one of them. The only good thing British soldiers found to do with empty flimsies was convert them into cooking stoves. They called these improvised devices Benghazi burners or Benghazi boilers. Cut a flimsy in half, fill the bottom with sand, pour in some gasoline, light it. You had a silent, fast, smokeless cooking fire that could heat water for tea or cook rations without revealing your position to enemy aircraft. It was a fitting end for containers that couldn't serve their intended purpose.
At least as stoves, they finally did
something useful. The British Army cooked its food with the same cans that lost its fuel.
Meanwhile, German jerry cans captured in battle became the most prized items in the desert.
British soldiers hoarded them, traded for them, and refused to let them out of their sight. The enemy's fuel containers were literally keeping the British Army
mobile. After the second capture of Benghazi at the end of 1941,
large numbers of German jerry cans fell into Allied hands.
Elite units like the Long-Range Desert Group were finally equipped with containers that actually worked.
These were the men who could now
range deep into enemy territory, confident their fuel would arrive intact. By 1942, General Montgomery understood the equation.
He made sure he had enough supplies, including jerry cans, to defeat RML, despite the waste caused by inferior containers. His victory at El Alamein owed something to the captured German cans that kept his
tanks moving. And where was America in all this?
Still using the flawed camp,
hollered design.
Still losing fuel to leaking seams and cracked welds.
Still requiring wrenches and funnels while British soldiers flipped cam levers and poured fuel in seconds. Still clinging to a design that traded battlefield effectiveness for warehouse economics.
That was the situation Commander Richard
Daniel walked into in September 1942.
Daniel and his colleague were quality control officers posted to American
refineries in the Middle East. Their job was to ensure fuel reached combat units in usable condition.
What they found was
appalling.
Fuel arrived by rail from the sea in 55-gallon steel drums with rolled seams and friction-sealed caps. Local laborers handled the drums roughly.
Many leaked before they reached the transfer point.
From there, fuel went into the infamous 5-gallon petrol tins. These were the same square cans of tin plate that had been used for decades to supply lamp kerosene. They were hardly suitable for
gasoline.
In the hot desert sun, they swelled, burst at the seams, and leaked. Every transfer required a funnel, which meant spillage. Every trip across rough
terrain meant more containers failing.
Daniel estimated that a massive percentage of gasoline shipped from America to Egypt was lost before reaching combat vehicles. Fuel that American refinery workers produced, that
American sailors risked their lives to transport across submarine-infested waters, that American taxpayers paid
for, was soaking into desert sand because nobody in Washington had listened to Paul P.S.
But Daniel also
saw the solution sitting right in front of him. Allied soldiers in Africa knew that the only gasoline container worth
having was German.
they fought to capture enemy jerry cans. They treasured British copies they refused to use. American containers if any alternative existed. Daniel examined the German cans. He noted the cam lever closure, the recessed weld, the breather tube, the synthetic resin lining. He compared them to the American version and understood immediately why one worked and the other didn't.
He sent an urgent report back to Washington. The Army's
5-gallon container was a disaster. The improved jerry can under consideration was little better. The Germans and British had already solved this problem. America needed to copy their solution exactly. Daniel's report landed on desks
in Washington and created immediate alarm.
Officials requested confirmation. Daniel provided it with detailed documentation of losses and comparative analysis of container designs.
The result was a major policy shift.
Production of the Camp-Hollard design was scaled back. An agreement was reached that British production of the original German design would be increased to supply both British and American forces for the invasion of Europe. The jerry can that the United States War Department had rejected in 1940 would finally equip American soldiers 4 years late, manufactured by British factories based on German engineering. Millions were ready by D-Day. The jerry can that Hitler had designed to fuel his conquest of Europe would now fuel his defeat. June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. 156,000 Allied troops crossed the English Channel in the pre-dawn darkness. 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft. American, British, and Canadian forces stormed the beaches of Normandy under withering German fire.
At Omaha Beach, American soldiers faced murderous crossfire from entrenched German positions on the bluffs above.
Over 2,000 American casualties fell on that single stretch of sand. But by nightfall, the Allies had a foothold on
the continent.
The liberation of Europe had begun. Behind those assault troops came the logistics.
Within hours of securing the beaches, supply operations began, landing craft-fight ammunition, food, medical supplies, and fuel onto the sand.
Every bullet, every bandage, every gallon of gasoline had to cross the channel and make its way inland. The invasion could only succeed if the supply chain held.
For 7 weeks, Allied
forces fought through the hedge of Normandy.
The dense Boage country, with its sunken lanes and thick vegetation, favored the defenders.
Every field became a fortress. Progress was measured in yards and paid for in blood. By the end of July, more than 1 million Allied soldiers were ashore in France, but they remained confined to a lodgment only 50 miles wide and 20 miles deep, roughly half the
size of Long Island. The invasion seemed in danger of bogging down into the trench warfare of 1914. Then came the breakout. On July 25, Operation Cobra punched through German lines south of St. Lo.
American bombers carpeted the German positions.
Infantry
and armor surged through the gaps. Suddenly, Allied forces burst out of the confined Normandy hedgerows and onto the
open fields of central France. General George Patton's Third Army, held in
reserve until now, was unleashed.
Patton was the perfect commander for this moment. Aggressive, relentless, impatient with caution. His tanks raced
eastward with a ferocity that stunned the Germans.
80 miles in a week, then 100
miles, then further still.
The Wehrmacht was in retreat, their lines collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. Patton
pushed his men and machines to their limits.
He didn't want to give the Germans time to regroup. He knew that momentum in warfare is a weapon as powerful as any tank gun.
Keep moving, keep attacking, keep the enemy off balance. His philosophy was simple.
A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week.
Paris fell on August 25. French
resistance fighters rose up within the city. Free French forces under General Lair entered the capital. The swastika came down from the Eiffel Tower. After 4 years of occupation, France was being liberated.
Victory seemed within reach. Then Patton's tanks began grinding to a halt. Not from enemy action, not from battle damage, from empty fuel tanks.
On
an average day, Patton's Third Army and General Courtney Hodge's First Army consumed a combined 800,000 gall of
gasoline, Think about that number, 800,000 gallons. Every single day,
28 divisions were advancing across France and Belgium, each requiring 700 to 750 tons of supplies per day: ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts, but mostly fuel.
Without fuel, tanks were just steel boxes. Without fuel, trucks couldn't deliver ammunition.
Without fuel, the advance
would stop, and the logistical system couldn't keep pace. The problem was geography and destruction. The railways
had been bombed to pieces by the Allies themselves before D-Day. A necessary destruction that had helped isolate the Normandy battlefield, but now crippled supply lines.
French railway workers had sabotaged
what the bombs had missed:
the elaborate rail network that had moved goods across.
France for decades was now a tangled wreck of twisted steel and shattered bridges. The Germans still held the
major cargo ports. Le Havre wouldn't fall until September 12. Antwerp, the Great
Prize, wouldn't be captured until September 4, and its approaches wouldn't be cleared of German resistance
until late November.
Until then, everything had to come through the congested Normandy beaches and the single artificial Mulberry Harbor that had survived the Great Storm of June 19. From those beaches, supplies had
to travel hundreds of miles by truck over narrow French roads to reach the front lines. Roads built for peacetime traffic were now carrying the weight of modern mechanized warfare.
They crumbled under the endless convoys.
Bridges
groaned under loads they were never designed to bear, and every mile of distance was a mile of potential failure.
For the supply chain,
General Omar Bradley later wrote in his autobiography that on both fronts an acute shortage of
supplies governed all operations.
That dull subject again, he called it.
But there was nothing dull about tanks sitting empty while German forces regrouped. In these desperate days of late August 1944,
American commanders conceived the Red Ball Express during a 36-hour brainstorming session.
Named after
railroad slang for express freight, it was a massive trucking operation that would become one of the greatest
logistical achievements in military history. Over 6,000 trucks were organized into non-stop convoys running on dedicated one-way routes.
One road northbound, one road southbound, both
reserved exclusively for military traffic.
French civilians were barred from using them. Signs with distinctive
red balls marked the routes. The drivers ran around the clock 20 hours a day with
only brief rest stops. They covered up to 350 miles each way from the Normandy beaches to supply dumps near Chartres and beyond. They drove at night without
headlights to avoid German aircraft, navigating by the faint glow of blackout lights on the truck ahead.
They pushed their vehicles until the engines gave out, then hitched rides back for replacements and started again.
Roughly 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were African American soldiers. The Army was segregated, and black troops were typically assigned to support rather than combat roles.
These men faced the danger of enemy strafing runs, the exhaustion of endless driving, and the discrimination of a nation that refused to acknowledge their courage. They drove through villages where French civilians cheered them as liberators. They pushed through checkpoints where German aircraft strafed their convoys. They wrestled with worn-out trucks, bald tires, and engines that overheated on the endless runs.
When vehicles broke down, they fixed what they could and abandoned what they couldn't. They slept in their cabs, ate cold rations on the move, and kept driving.
The conditions were brutal.
Summer dust coated everything. Autumn rains turned roads to mud. Drivers went days without proper rest. Accidents were common on the blackout runs, trucks colliding in the darkness or sliding off rain-slicked roads. Some drivers were killed by German aircraft.
Others died in crashes.
Most just kept driving until the exhaustion and the stress wore them down to nothing. They kept the liberation moving anyway.
Without the Red Ball Express, without those
predominantly black drivers, Patton's advance would have stopped dead.
The liberation of France was carried on the
backs of men who weren't even allowed to eat in the same mess halls as their white counterparts.
And what filled many of those trucks?
Jerry cans, 5-gallon containers stacked by the hundreds. Each one carrying the fuel that kept Patton's tanks advancing. When fuel tankers weren't available, petroleum moved in. 55 gall drums and 5-gallon jerry cans. An armored division needed over 73,000 gall of fuel just to move 100 m.
A single 2/2-ton truck could carry 875 gallons in
jerry cans. Do the math.
It took fleets of trucks carrying thousands upon
thousands of cans to keep the armor rolling. From August 25 through November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express operated continuously. Motor transport services hauled over
412,000 tons of supplies, including vast quantities of fuel stored in jerry cans. On its peak day, August 29, the Red Ball Express delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies using nearly 6,000 vehicles. By Victory in Europe Day, some 21 million Allied jerry cans were scattered across the continent.
21 million. The
German design that Hitler had stockpiled for Blitzkrieg was now powering the Allied advance that would destroy his
Reich.
The losses were staggering, a testament to the chaos of modern mechanized warfare. Soldiers were
supposed to return empty cans to collection points for refilling. In theory, the same can could make dozens of trips between depot and front line. In practice, empty cans were abandoned everywhere.
In the desperate race across France, soldiers had no time to organize logistics properly.
Empty cans were thrown from moving trucks to save weight.
They were used as stepping stones across muddy fields.
They propped
up tables in field headquarters. They became improvised latrines, toolboxes,
cooking pots, and furniture.
Some were simply left where they fell, forming metallic carpets across the French
countryside. In October 1944 alone, 3.5 million jerry cans were reported lost. 3.5 million in a single month.
The shortage became so severe that it threatened to slow the advance.
Fuel was available in rear areas, but there weren't enough containers to carry it forward.
The logistical miracle was choking on its own success.
The American military
offered cash rewards to French civilians for returning empty containers. The prize system spread across liberated
France.
French schoolchildren scoured fields, ditches, and roadsides,
collecting discarded cans and hauling them to collection points.
They searched hedge and farmers, drainage ditches,
and abandoned bivouacs.
Every recovered can was another trip's worth of fuel that could reach the front.
Approximately 1 million cans were recovered this way.
French farmers found jerry cans useful for their own purposes and kept many that might otherwise have returned to military use.
The cans made excellent containers for milk, water,
fertilizer, and 100 other farm needs. To this day, World War II era jerry cans turn up for sale at markets throughout Normandy. They surface in old barns, in estate sales, in the collections of militaria enthusiasts who recognize the distinctive German design. But even with the losses, even with the chaos, the Gerians kept fuel flowing to combat vehicles.
The system bent but didn't break. The advance continued.
The Germans retreated toward their homeland, and the humble fuel container, the one piece of equipment that nobody wrote songs about, proved decisive. The scale of the operation was staggering.
Thousands of trucks running day and night. Millions of jerry cans cycling between rear areas and the front.
A river of fuel flowing across France measured not in barrels but in individual 5-gallon containers.
Each can was filled, transported, emptied, and ideally returned to be filled again. The entire system depended on those rectangular steel containers with their distinctive cross indentations and 3 handles.
Allied commanders understood what had happened. The jerry can had enabled an advance across France that exceeded even the pace of the German Blitzkrieg of 1940. American armies had advanced faster than the German armies that invented lightning warfare.
The student had
surpassed the teacher in the jerry can. A German design turned against its creators had made that possible.
The irony was perfect.
Hitler had developed the jerry can to fuel his conquest of Europe.
Instead, it fueled his defeat. The container that carried gasoline for German panzers rolling into Poland carried gasoline for American tanks rolling into Germany. The innovation that enabled Blitzkrieg enabled the liberation. In the official records in Washington, little is said about the jerry can's contribution. A military report notes simply that a sample of the
Jerry can was brought to the office of the Quartermaster General in the summer of 1940. No mention of the rejection, no mention of the flawed redesign, no mention of Commander Daniel's urgent report from
Egypt, no admission of error. The institutional memory prefers silence to embarrassment.
The American failure
wasn't corrected until Commander Daniel's report from Egypt forced Washington to confront reality. By then the war was 3 years old. Countless tons of fuel had been lost to leaking containers. Operations had stalled for lack of gasoline.
Men had died because their vehicles ran dry at critical moments.
All because officials in Washington had assumed they knew better than the German engineer who had actually solved the problem.
The Jerry Can story reveals a pattern that appears throughout military history. Innovation often comes from unexpected places.
The best solutions sometimes belong to the enemy, and institutions frequently reject what they didn't invent themselves. Paul P.S. never received official recognition for
transferring Jerry and technology to the Allied cause. He served as a European industry consultant to the Board of Economic Warfare during the war and attained the rank of colonel, yet he died in 1947 without recognition for his vital contributions. Commander Daniel's report saved the Allied fuel supply, but his name is largely forgotten outside specialized military history circles. The Jerry Can itself, the unassuming container that helped enable the liberation of France, receives no monuments.
No museum exhibits celebrate its 8 ingenious design details.
No historians have written best-selling books about Vinzenz Grunvogel and his revolutionary creation.
Today, the Jerry Can remains in service with militaries around the globe. NATO countries still employ containers based on the 1937 German design.
Modern iterations have evolved from steel to high-density polyethylene polymer, but the essential features remain unchanged. The cam lever closure, the recessed weld, the breather tube, the 3 handles, they all function as effectively today as they did nearly 90 years ago. Walk into any Army surplus store and you can purchase a Jerry Can. Hold it, flip the lever, open the spout. Feel how solidly it closes.
Understand that you are holding a piece of engineering perfection that helped determine the outcome of the deadliest conflict in human history. The lesson is unmistakable. In war, every detail matters. The design of a fuel container seems insignificant compared to tanks, aircraft, and battleships.
It does not fire bullets, drop bombs, or sink ships. Yet without fuel, tanks do not move. Without moving tanks, armies cannot advance. Without advancing armies, wars cannot be won.
A German engineer named Vinzenz Grunvogel understood this in the mid-1930s.
Working at Schwelmer Eisenwerk Müller and Company in Schwelm, he designed a container that addressed every challenge soldiers would face in mechanized warfare. He considered how men would carry it, how they would open it under fire, how it would withstand rough handling, and how it would perform in extreme temperatures.
He scrutinized every detail because he knew details were decisive. An American engineer named Paul P.S. understood this in 1939 and 1940 as a senior executive at Amby Budd Presswork, one of the manufacturers producing Jerry Cans. He recognized the design's brilliance and labored to transfer that knowledge to America, attempting to give his country an advantage that could save thousands of lives. A naval commander named Richard Daniel understood it in 1942.
Standing in the Egyptian desert, surrounded by leaking American cans and flawless German ones, he grasped what Washington had missed.
He wrote the report that eventually forced the American military to confront its failures. Over time, American officials understood as well.
They scaled back production of flawed designs, collaborated with the British to produce Jerry Cans for both armies, and implicitly admitted past errors.
But understanding came late, and in war, late understanding is measured in lives. How many soldiers died because their vehicles ran out of fuel? How many offensives stalled because supplies could not keep pace? How many victories turned to stalemates due to logistical failure?
The numbers are impossible to calculate, yet they are certainly greater than zero. The Jerry Can stands as a testament to the power of thoughtful design.
When something works perfectly, the goal is preservation, not improvement.
The Jerry Can worked perfectly from its inception, which is why it endures. Its story offers a warning to institutions that assume they have nothing to learn from outsiders.
The American military of 1940 was not short of talent or resources, it was short of humility.
The assumption that American methods must be superior blinded officials to evidence directly before them. Paul P.S. did not simply bring a can to Washington, he brought a complete engineering solution, tested and refined through German military procurement, proven in the field.
He explained why every feature mattered and provided detailed specifications ready for immediate production.
The response was institutional indifference, followed by a redesign that preserved nothing but the external shape. This pattern recurs throughout history. Organizations reject outside innovations not due to incapacity, but because acknowledging superiority elsewhere threatens internal hierarchies and assumptions. The cost is measured in failure, waste, and, in wartime, lives.
The British, fighting for survival, could not afford such pride.
They replicated the German design exactly and equipped their forces with containers that worked.
America eventually followed, but only after years of unnecessary losses.
Today, the jerrycan sits quietly in military museums, an unassuming artifact displayed alongside tanks and heavy artillery.
Visitors often pass without a second glance. It does not look like a weapon.
It does not appear to have changed the course of history.
Yet without it, the liberation of Europe would have ground to a halt.
Tanks would have stopped, trucks would have stalled, the advance would have died. The next time you see a jerrycan at a surplus store or in someone's garage, pause to appreciate what you are holding.
That simple metal container, with its distinctive shape and ingenious closure, represents engineering excellence that has outlasted the regime that created it. The design is so perfect that it remains unsurpassed nearly a century later. Remember that America almost discarded it.
Remember that institutional arrogance nearly cost the Allies one of their most crucial logistical advantages. Remember that sometimes the best solution already exists, and the hardest part is recognizing it. Sometimes the most important innovations do not announce themselves, they simply hold gasoline. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more of these overlooked stories from the Second World War.
Subscribe to stay connected.